This podcast explores themes of violence, self-harm, and murder. Listener discretion is advised. Please note, some of the voices you hear in this series have been performed by actors. Previously on Mind of a Monster, the Killer Nurse.
We had an example of her wanting to leave early and saying, if this person dies, can I leave? And then suddenly he dies.
I got home that day and got a phone call that he had had a heart attack.
Then she noticed it was Kristen that was usually in the center of things.
Kristen Gilbert is a healthcare serial killer convicted of murdering 4 patients, attempting to murder 2 more, and suspected of killing dozens of others. Her victim count could be as high as in the hundreds. From ID and Arrow Media, I'm criminal psychologist Dr. Michelle Ward, and this is Mind of a Monster, the Killer Nurse. Chapter 4, The Investigation. It's February 15th, 1996. After the shock of discovering the empty epinephrine drawer in the ICU following patient Ed Square's cardiac arrest, nurses Kathy Ricks, John Wall, and Renee Walsh call the nurse manager, Melody Turner. She is their direct senior and acts as a liaison between nurses and administrators. A meeting is arranged for Saturday, February 17th. With the casually discarded epinephrine, plus the numerous instances of Kristen being close to patients immediately preceding their death, it appears she is becoming sloppy. Beatrice Yorker is a former nurse and professor of criminal justice at California State University.
Kristen Gilbert started to become brazen, and I think that's because she was not stopped when she knew that she was crossing the line and doing catchable things. And she was like, they're not going to catch me. I can just do this.
Meanwhile, Ed Square's condition worsens, and he's transferred to Bay State Medical Center for specialist observation. Ed Square's granddaughter, Sarah, was just 7 at the time.
In talking to my dad, he said that he remembered kind of deterring my sister and I from visiting him because he was in a state that my dad thought would be traumatic for us to see and that we didn't want to remember him that way. So I never went to visit him while he was in the hospital, but I do remember my dad going.
After a day or so at Bay State, Ed is transported back to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, or the VAMC, Northampton. His son, Ed Square Jr., describes what happened.
I spent the night at the VA hospital sitting with him. He was extremely restless the whole time, and something just didn't add up because they were supposedly giving him pain medicine, but he wasn't comfortable. And he was acting like somebody who was being sedated but not given any pain medicine.
It's February 17th, 1996. The day of the staff meeting arrives, and Kathy Ricks, John Wall, and Renee Walsh meet with nurse manager Melody Turner. They share their concerns with her and make a plan. Kristen can't be fired without evidence, but there is a need to remove her or at least neutralize her from the ward. There's just one problem. Kristen is due to start her shift in a matter of hours. Melody Turner tells Kathy Ricks, John Wall, and Renee Walsh that she will offer Kristen the night off.
I told them that I would take care of the staffing on the ward, and I made a plan to cover the ward. I told John to go to the ward, and I told him that I wanted Kristen to be off and that we were going to get her off duty, and that's what we were going to do.
Just the week before, Melody had reprimanded Kristen for not showing up to her Saturday shift, so the request risks seeming out of character. Nevertheless, Melody calls Ward C and Kristen answers. She refuses to end her shift. This was not supposed to happen, and panicked, John Wall follows Kristen from patient to patient. She becomes suspicious. What's going through her mind at this point? Surely things can't continue this way. Then something happens that no one could have predicted. Massachusetts State Detective Lieutenant Tom Soutier explains.
When she thought it might be looking at her, she somehow got injured. She said that one of the patients twisted her arm and that she was injured.
At reception with a bandaged arm, Kristen asks to go home. As well as claiming to have had her arm twisted out of its socket, she also alleges that the incident had caused her to accidentally puncture herself in the hand with a dirty needle. Dislocating an arm is an enormously painful experience. However, as Kristen Gilbert's boyfriend James Perrault would explain, all is not quite as it seems.
She had showed me that she was able to dislocate it at will, and she had made a comment several times that she was able to do like that actor in Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon, and able to pop it in and out just like him through twisting it in certain ways. She was able to cause the socket or the shoulder to pop out of the socket.
And she went home on injured leave and wore a cast for a while, or not a cast, just a sling.
From that point on, Kristen is put on sick leave. Finally, she is out of the hospital. During their meeting last Saturday, Melody Turner gave Kathy Ricks, John Wall, and Renee Walsh some advice.
I told them to get attorneys.
The following day, February 18th, 1996, Ed Squira dies at the VAMC Northampton. Age 7, Sarah Squira attends her grandpa's funeral.
It was in the church in the town my grandparents lived in. And so it's a fairly small Catholic church. I remember sitting with my parents, and I just remember sitting and crying, and kind of loudly crying. And I do know that it was an open casket. Maybe that's what really made it real to me, was seeing his dead body. Sometimes I think that it helps you really kind of wrap your mind around that the person is gone. So I think having his casket be open is what made me really understand that he was not there anymore and that I wouldn't see him again.
There are now 4 unexpected patient deaths in just over 5 months that can be closely connected to Kristen Gilbert. Stanley Jagodowski dies August 21st, 1995, age 66. 15 weeks later, on December 8th, 1995, Henry Houdon dies, age 35. 8 weeks later, Kenneth Cutting dies on February 2nd, 1996, at age 40. Then, 10 days later, on February 18th, 1996, Edward Squira dies at age 69. Ever since his death in December 1995, Henry Houdon's sister Christine has been searching for answers.
So they gave me a call when a copy of his records were sent back there, and I went back up and I got them. And on the way home, I had to pass the Northampton State Police Barracks, and I stopped in. Make a long story short, they laughed me right out the door. So I went from there to the Northampton newspaper, the Hampshire Gazette, immediately.
Wow. You are quite the sister.
That's where it all started. And they did an article, and the next thing you know, I got a phone call from the local news, Channel 40, Channel 22, Channel 3 in Hartford. And I'm getting so much mail from reporters all across the country of mishaps that have happened in VA centers.
Unbeknownst to Christine, on the same day as Ed Squira's death, February 18, 1996, investigations into Kristen Gilbert begin. Melody Turner informs the head of medicine at Northampton VA and is instructed to pull all the files for every emergency code in which Kristen has been involved. She, Kathy Ricks, John Wall, and Renee Walsh are also told to speak to the head of security at the VAMC as part of what they call an internal administrative investigation. Bruce Sackman was a special agent in the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs in the 1990s and early 2000s.
So Veterans Affairs hospitals are federal hospitals, and every federal agency in the United States has an Office of Inspector General. And the purpose of the Office of Inspector General is to ferret out fraud, waste, and abuse. And the Office of Inspector General is an independent agency. It reports to Congress and it reports to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs.
Right.
Now, inside the VA Office of Inspector General, we had 3 different divisions. We have an Office of Audit that does audits. We had something that most other IGs don't have, which is an Office of Healthcare Inspections. And this is an office of doctors and nurses and other people who go to the hospitals and make sure they're compliant with all the rules and regulations, policies, and procedures. But they're not criminal investigators, okay? The 3rd division is the division that I had for the Northeast, was the Criminal Investigation Division. And we were the cops who carried guns and made arrests and did all that criminal work for the VA hospital system.
It is the second of these departments, the Office for Healthcare Inspections, that goes to VAMC Northampton first.
After these allegations surfaced that Kristen may be harming patients, they sent a team in, and this team concluded that there was nothing wrong.
It turned out the way most everybody thought it was going to turn out. They didn't see any misconduct. They didn't see any malpractice. All is good and well at Leeds Hospital. I knew better, at least as far as my brother is concerned.
They claimed that they could find no evidence of wrongdoing. Kristen Gilbert, who is now on permanent leave owing to her shoulder injury, is all but cleared. In the mid-1990s, Bruce Sackman was the lead investigator in the case against Dr. Michael Swango on Long Island. He was convicted of killing 3, but suspected of murdering up to 60 patients by poisoning. Bruce is one of the few within the VA system with experience investigating healthcare serial killers. The VA calls Bruce to gather a team to help with this huge investigation. What did you think of the results of the first investigation?
Being the cynical New Yorker that I am, I said, well, who's on this team? And he said, well, there were doctors and very good people, but none of them were really trained in criminal investigation. And I said, well, you know what? Since we've been successful with this Swango case on Long Island, let me send some people to take a look at this Kristen Gilbert case.
I see.
And they interviewed some of the whistleblowers and some of the nurses. And then they came back to my office and we had a meeting. I said, well, what do you think? And the leader of the team at that time said, who here thinks Kristen Gilbert murdered the patients? And all the investigators raised their hand. Wow. Wow.
That's unbelievable.
Okay. Wow. So what do we do now?
It's important to reflect on how utterly remarkable this situation is. Kristen Gilbert has been linked to the deaths of 4 people, and yet she is still walking free. Her nursing license has not been revoked. She's not been fired. She's simply home on sick leave. If she wanted, she could apply for a job elsewhere. With the benefit of hindsight, this situation is unbelievable. I speak to Bruce about how his criminal investigation department within the VA's Inspector General office first became aware of the case in Northampton. In the VA system in the 1990s, you were just hospitals, right? Like that was you were just investigating crime within the hospital?
Well, in the hospitals, in the outpatient clinics, in what we called the extended care centers, which were nursing homes, and also in the regional offices where they administered benefits to veterans. That was my world. And I had an incredible smorgasbord of cases to pick and choose from because most people don't realize that hospitals are like small cities. There's a tremendous amount of crime that could occur in a hospital, and people don't even think about it. Most people think that you go to a hospital after you're a victim of a crime, not to first become a victim of a crime. And to me, a hospital was always like a sanctuary from crime, right?
Well, you would think so. It's where you go to get help, not to get hurt.
Yes, and of course it is, but there's so much that can go wrong in a hospital. Then the last thing in the world he or she needs is someone that's intentionally murdering their patients. My God.
When did the Kristen Gilbert case first land on your desk?
I remember I got the call, and this is what happened. Apparently, some staff people had complained to management that every time nurse Kristen Gilbert was on duty, the death rate went up. She took time off, the death rate went down. Now, that doesn't mean that she's a serial killer. Hey, there might be legitimate reasons. She might have the most complex cases. There might be something like that. The interesting thing was, though, that these patients weren't expected to expire when they did. And that's a pattern that I've seen doing these cases now throughout the world. Mm-hmm. The patients have a lot of medical problems. That's why they're in the ICU. The first time I looked at a veteran's medical file that was in the ICU, the file was, 12 inches thick. I didn't know you could be alive and have this much wrong with you. And now I have to prove you were murdered? So you could see how easy it could be for people to, say, there's so much wrong with him. This death could have been a result of his natural disease processes. Because look how many ailments he had. Look how many things wrong with him. So here you have a victim in a hospital surrounded by the most professional, caring nurses and doctors. They would never do anything to intentionally harm a person.
You think,
right? So it can't be. We refuse to believe that one of our co-workers who has taken that oath,
I solemnly pledge myself before God.
The doctors have taken that Hippocratic oath.
My life in purity and to practice
The nurses take something called the Florence Nightingale oath, which is very similar,
from whatever is deleterious and
which says essentially, I will not do anything to harm a
will
patient.
not take or knowingly administer any harmful drug.
And of course, 99.9% of the medical profession feels exactly that way and acts that way. In fact, that's why it's so easy to hide. Because look, if I was inclined to kill a number of people, if I'm in the mafia, if I'm in a motorcycle gang, that's where you'd expect me to be. But you wouldn't expect me to be in a group of the most dedicated, honest, hardworking, compassionate people you ever want to meet.
Right. The VA's criminal investigation team starts to interview staff and consult medical files.
So in spite of all of this, if it wasn't for these brave nurse whistleblowers, we wouldn't be here today having this conversation.
That makes sense.
And it took a tremendous amount of courage. Because, when you become a whistleblower, now all of a sudden, you're kind of under investigation. Let me ask you a question there, nurse. If we drug tested you today, are you going to turn up positive in anything? Is your license and all your training up to snuff? How's your eyesight? I just asked you this because these are the kind of questions you're going to be asked if you have to testify in this case. And by the way, did you actually see Nurse Kristen Gilbert kill anybody? Well, no, I didn't actually see, but, she's the last person here and, well, that's not the same, nurse, And what's the matter? You don't like working at this hospital? You know what happens if this gets in the news, nurse? They're going to close down this hospital. You're going to be out of a job. I'm going to be out of a job.
That's right.
So unless you've actually have 100% proof that Kristen Gilbert killed somebody, just be happy you have a job and go back to your little ward and let's just move on. Because if this gets out in the community, we're all going to be out of work.
A killer is on the loose. But even as they start to build a case, there's another hurdle to clear, as Bruce explains.
Most brand new agents think that as soon as you have evidence of a crime, you go to the prosecutor and they're going to prosecute it. It doesn't work that way. You really have to sell your case. Why? because there are so many other agencies trying to sell their cases and get the attention of prosecutors. They have the FBI, Secret Service, Drug Enforcement Administration, Customs, a whole host, every IG from every federal agency, and they all have what they call an intake assistant. And he sits there, an assistant U.S. attorney, and he listens and he decides as to whether or not going to take the case or not. So it's a sales job.
The federal prosecutor at the time is William Welch.
I recall that it was a Friday afternoon. It's probably early afternoon, and two special agents from the VA called, and they basically said on the phone that they'd like to meet with me because they believe they had a serial killer up at the Northampton VA Medical Center. And my first reaction was, this is someone who's pranking me. There's no way like this is going on. But the voice didn't sound familiar. The way they were talking sounded quite genuine. And they wanted to meet that day. And the very odd part of all of it was I was what's called the duty attorney. So in most U.S. attorney offices, you have a lawyer that for that particular work week will take in all of the calls from the public. And I would say 90% of our calls and 90% of our visits are individuals wearing, the tinfoil hat, and they've got something crazy to report. But the other 10% are things that, you want to look at, and you can discern the two pretty quickly. But they wanted to meet me, and I said, sure, come on in. I think they were there within 45 minutes. They laid out for me the facts that they had developed to date, their theory about what was going on, and they wanted to initiate a grand jury investigation. And my thought was, well, one, this sounds pretty crazy, like this can't really be going on. But number two, I can't ignore this. I mean, the facts that they told me to that point, the allegations, the fact that we were talking about incredibly vulnerable victims, and this nurse was still up there, all warranted doing something at that point in time.
Bruce Sackman. Was Bill Welch a hard sale?
No. I've had a whole career of hard sales. He was not. He was fantastic. He had never done a homicide case. My office had never done a homicide case. This is real amateur hour here, okay? I mean, I had the one on Long Island, so I was like the big expert. I had one case. But Bill Welch had never done a homicide case, but he was fascinated and intrigued by what we had to say. And he rolled up his sleeves and jumped on board. And then he got an assistant prosecutor. Her name was Ariane Voluno. Outstanding, really outstanding. She had been a state prosecutor before being a federal prosecutor, and she had done homicide cases. And then lastly, I said, well, I'm going to have one of my agents, Steve Plant, permanently assigned to this case until it's over. But the state police had their homicide investigator, a guy named Kevin Murphy, who was very well experienced. And him and Steve Plant got along. The whole team got along like family.
I've heard that from so many people, Bruce. I spoke with Steve on the phone. What a guy. And he had just most wonderful things to say about Mr. Murphy, about you, about everybody involved.
I've had a lot of joint cases, and sometimes there's agency conflicts and disagreements. This was textbook perfect. Steve Plant kind of looks like Jean-Claude Van Damme.
I saw that.
Oh, he was a charmer. The nurses loved him. He was a charmer. And Kevin Murphy, more the Dirty Harry type. But the two of them, the team was just amazing. I mean, just really fantastic.
As strong as they were, members of the investigative team had the unenviable task of informing families that the loved ones they thought had died natural, albeit unexpected, deaths had actually been murdered. Victim Henry Houdon's sister, Christine Duquette.
I just had a gut feeling that if the media takes hold of this, they're going to have to come up with some kind of answers. So the media did take hold of it, and it was like wildfire between all the newspapers, all the TV Next thing we know, I was called and it was turned over to the Northampton District Attorney's Office, Elizabeth Scheibel. And they asked me if I could go to her office, and I did. And that's when I was introduced to Bill Welch, a U.S. attorney from Springfield, and Kevin Murphy, who was head of homicide for the Massachusetts State Police. Okay, so now there is going to be a real investigation. Let's hope it really is a real investigation.
So when you first went and met with the U.S. attorney and these detectives, did they introduce the idea to you that it was Kristen, or did you start suspecting Kristen?
No, they introduced the idea.
And how did you feel hearing that this could have been potentially a homicide, not an accident?
Horrible. Absolutely horrible. And trying to put myself in the situation of three of her, not just co-workers, but also personal friends. If it were not for them, I don't know that they would have been able to find anything.
William Welch, you must have felt tremendous pressure to do something very quickly, because it's not common where you're investigating a criminal, a murderer, and he or she is among the population where she could continue to do it.
Yeah, I think there was pressure to act, but I think there's also an equal countervailing force to make sure that you do everything in the right way.
Yeah, because we have seen cases go sideways. Investigating hospitals is uniquely tough, as Bruce Sackman explains to me.
Look, most cops, and I put myself in this position, we didn't become cops because we were good in chemistry and biology, okay? So we're very dependent on the medical professionals. We can't really challenge what they tell us scientifically. We don't understand the hospital rules. What documents do I need a subpoena for? What documents do I need a search warrant? Do I need a court order? Can I get this document? Can I not get that? Oh, this is so confusing.
With all of these baked-in challenges, it's crucial that the investigative team interrogates each and every record. I discussed this with William Welch. How are healthcare cases investigated? And how was this case investigated?
I would say we took the following approach. Number one, we treated each body as a crime scene. And that meant we knew that the body would be able to give us all kinds of information, both in terms of what's documented within the medical notes, what's not in the medical notes, and then obviously what we would learn from the autopsy. I would call that the bones of our case. And then from that, the next phase was really to talk to as many eyewitnesses, percipient witnesses as we could. And that was obviously the three senior registered nurses that came forward. That was the nursing assistant who saw her run out of Stanley Jagodowski's room like Wile E. Coyote. That was, talking to a variety of people who could give us insights into who Kristen Gilbert was and why she may have been doing it. And then I would call the final level or layer of our investigation was going out and getting experts to be able to look at the facts that we had developed and then opine as to what they believed had occurred.
None of the bodies were autopsied right after they died, except for Henry Houdon, after his family insisted on it. As the internal review evolves into a criminal investigation, Kristen's behavior becomes incredibly telling. She is worried and angry as one by one of her friends and colleagues start to distance themselves from her. Her estranged husband, Glenn, notices the fury.
There were expressions of anger toward anyone that Kristen saw as cooperating with the investigation.
What's more, James Perrault reveals that following the alleged incident with her twisted arm,
she was out of work at that time, but she just laid around the house all day long doing nothing, sometimes not even getting out of bed. When her children would come over, she just let them fend for themselves while they were there.
It's a million miles away from the carefree social butterfly we've seen up until this point. But interestingly, rather than withdrawing completely, she tries to manipulate the situation through James. She convinces him to report back to her on the developments in the investigation.
She was stating that the whole reason that the deaths were occurring was just due to the time of year, being winter, the ages of the patients, and that their physical ailments or their illnesses, and she stated that that would account for the number of deaths up there, and the fact that the deaths would go in spurts up there. She would ask me to relay the events of the interviews, what was asked and what I had said, who had been interviewed of the staff by the investigators and what they had said, and to put in a good word for herself.
We see ample evidence during the investigation of Kristen's manipulative behavior. In an attempt to control the situation and gather information, Kristen bombards her former colleagues with phone calls. She pleads with some nurses to tell investigators that she's a good nurse. To others, she feigns ignorance about where the epinephrine is stored in Ward C and plays down the number of codes as being normal. There are calls about whether the families of the deceased patients had or would be filing lawsuits. When one friend speaks to investigators, Glenn Gilbert claims Kristen reacts with,
"How could that bitch speak with those people?"
Nurse Renee Walsh gets phone calls too. At one point, Kristen asks her,
"You don't think anyone would be stupid enough to tell the investigators that they used to call me the Angel of Death, do you?"
The night before James is due to be questioned by investigators, he and Kristen have an argument. Her mental state appears to spiral, and she falls back on a tactic that she'd used as a teenager: threats of self-harm. James Peralt.
She had gone into the bathroom and came back into the bedroom. When I went in there, I found an empty bottle of Tylenol, which I knew to be full earlier to that because I seen her buy it or seen a new bottle in the cabinet. And when I asked her about it, she stated that she didn't know anything about it, and that led me to believe she swallowed the bottle.
He takes her straight to the ER, fearing she has overdosed. She's kept in the hospital until the early hours, but James Peralt still shows up for work the next day, March 6th, and is interviewed by investigators. On March 12th, just 3 weeks after Kristen was put on sick leave, she too is summoned for an interview with Special Agent Steve Plant. William Welch tells the story.
His report back to me was that she sort of took on the mantle of the victim. Like, poor me, how can they be accusing me of these, awful crimes? They're just mad at me because I left my husband and I'm now seeing James Peralt. All of these patients were incredibly sick. This is just a consequence of people that are harboring some ill will against me, and the fact that all of these victims had a lot of really debilitating conditions. But he described her as really kind of taking on the mantle of victim and, saw right through it. I think he immediately got a sense that this was not right.
I would love to have been in that room. I spoke with Steve on the phone. He was saying a lot about, just how she was, and very similar to what you just described, but not with that kind of, confirmation that she, of course, would see herself as the victim, because that's who she is. Talk to me about the role of James Peralt. When, why, and how did he start cooperating with investigators?
Well, he cooperated from the beginning, but I think, again, it was an issue of developing some trust with him. I believe that Kristen had so infected his mind in terms of portraying herself as the victim that his initial reaction was to try to protect her, which of course is exactly what she wanted to occur.
But the relationship is no longer moonlight and roses. Gone are the honeymoon days of the autumn before. Now there are fights and anger, and on one occasion, James claims that Kristen
punched me twice in the testicles.
James makes the mistake of trying to break up with her. Her reaction is to claim that she's taken a bunch of fiorinol pills, an aspirin and codeine combo. But when James insists on taking her to the ER, she refuses. Instead, he calls the police and Kristen's estranged husband, Glenn. Glenn Gilbert.
She was incapacitated on the floor of the kitchen, crying in a sort of a loud, uncontrollable sob. She went to the parking lot area of the apartment complex and began kicking the side door of my car. She was angered at myself for interfering.
The police arrive on the scene, and she is taken to the psychiatric ward of nearby Holyoke Hospital. There's a lot of evidence pointing to Kristen having borderline personality disorder, potentially along with other issues as well. I speak to forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland about the effect a breakup will have on someone like Kristen.
Well, you don't get to break up with someone like this. They're the ones who are in charge. So you try to break up. And that's the kind of behavior I see in people with borderline personality disorder, is that property damage, the phone calls, the harassment, the constant zeroing in on them with these angry things. But certainly that was a way to show him. I'm surprised she didn't try to get him back into the relationship so she could break it up. Because that's a typical move too, is come back to me so that I'm the one in charge.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I've seen people with a lot fewer mental problems than she has do that, because nobody likes to be the one who gets broken up with. William Welch continues the story. So let's talk about Kristen's stay at Holyoke Hospital.
Yeah, so during I would call it the March 96 through the summer of 96 time frame, Kristen Gilbert was put on leave. But during this time, I think she tried to create as much chaos as she possibly could. She did so through articulated threats of self-harm. She did it through suicide attempts that I do not believe were real. It was overdosing on aspirin and things of that nature. And I think the whole point of it was to create distractions away from what we were doing, but also to continue to burnish her image as the victim. Kind of the woe is me, the forces of the world are bearing down on me and I can't survive. So I thought all of it was all made up, number one. But number two, people grew so tired of it, I think they began to really wonder what was really going on. And it actually worked to our benefit, I believe.
Yeah, and she's showing her colors at this point. She thinks that you're going to ignore a bunch of dead bodies because she's crying, and that's not how an investigation works. The heat is now firmly on Kristen Gilbert, and with evidence mounting, cracks are starting to show. The next day, seemingly still hysterical, Kristen makes an extraordinary phone call to James Perrault. Calling from Holyoke Hospital, she says,
I did it. I injected those guys.
Next time on Mind of a Monster, the Killer Nurse.
There are 3 explosive devices in Building 1. You have 2 hours. Nothing will compare as to what is going to happen tonight.
The probability of this occurring by chance was 1 in 100 million.
While he was there, she let the air out of one of his tires where it was parked.
And then they said, we think that Kristen Gilbert is the most prolific mass murderer on the East Coast.
Mind of a Monster, the Killer Nurse is produced by Arrow Media, a Fremantle company, for ID. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Ward. You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts, and we'd love it if you could take a second to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts.